Part 23 ended inside the institutions where the powerless were held, prisoners and mental patients, experimented on because they could not refuse. Tonight we stay inside medicine, but we change the question. Not who was experimented on, but what happened to the language of care itself. This is part 24 of 50, the weaponization of psychiatry, from the seed to psychosurgery. Before a word of it, one promise. Nothing here is advice to refuse treatment. 10 words. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. They were not written by a philosopher or a medical association. They were written by American judges Walter Beals, Harold Sebring, and Johnson Crawford, into a war crimes verdict at Nuremberg in 1947, at the close of the doctor's trial. On paper, those 10 words settled the argument before it could begin. This episode follows what happened to them afterwards. Knowledge Targeting is a 50-part documentary series from TI One Voice. It works through the literature of targeting one chapter at a time, the testimony, the technical claims, the court records, and the government documents, at the pace of a reader rather than a headline. Each episode runs 2 hours, long enough to show the evidence instead of summarizing it. Every claim is checked against a curated knowledge base. This is episode 24. Part 23, Captive Populations, Experiments on Prisoners and Mental Patients, came immediately before this one, and it left a question hanging. Part 25, The Department of Defense and the National Security State, follows next. Between them sits tonight's subject. Not the people held, but the vocabulary used about them. Section 3, The Institutional Framework, opened at Part 21. 26 episodes still lie ahead of this one. This is a middle, not an ending. This series is made by TI One Voice, and the platform behind it is open to you. At one.witisk.org, there is an evidence library where testimony is filed in a structured form, a knowledge base of thousands of researched articles, and a community wall where people compare notes rather than shout past each other. The sources for tonight's episode are cataloged there. Go and check them against what you hear. There is also TI TV, a live stream that runs around the clock at meet.witisk.org, under public TI TV. Episodes of this series play there in rotation, alongside documentaries, interviews, and community broadcasts. No account is needed and nothing is charged. Every part also carries a written companion article on the platform, with the citations, the page references, and the links. If tonight's subject is hard to sit with, read it instead. A word on how this episode was made. The spine is the book chapter itself, worked through in order section by section. Around it we retrieve supporting passages from the TI One Voice knowledge base using semantic search, and every retrieved passage is named on screen. Nothing is invented to fill the runtime. Where the sources disagree, you will hear that, and where the record simply stops, you will hear that too, in plain words. 3 labels run through this episode, and tonight they matter more than in any part so far. Documented means a named case, a named inquiry, a date. Context means what the profession itself changed afterwards and what it did not. Inference means any line we draw from that history to a present-day targeting claim. Inference is our argument, not anybody's finding, and it will be announced as inference every single time it appears. Now the most important sentence in this episode, and it comes before the history rather than after it. Nothing you are about to hear is a reason to stop a prescribed medication, to miss an appointment, or to avoid asking for help. Mental illness is real. Treatment helps an enormous number of people every day, including people watching this. If you are in crisis tonight, please tell someone, a doctor, a helpline, a friend. Say it plainly a second time, because a title like tonight's can be misread. The chapter we are following does not argue that psychiatry is inherently a weapon. Its author calls that idea a slander on a specialty that has relieved more suffering than any polemic can acknowledge. The argument is narrower, and whatever you conclude about the history, do not change a prescription because of a film. Talk to your doctor first. The chapter runs to 11 sections in 2 arcs, and this episode follows them in order. The first arc stays in America and in the 1974 Senate file, a Florida drug program called The Seed, the federal paper trail that funded it, and a Veterans Administration circular on brain surgery. The second arc goes abroad, the Soviet Union, South Africa, China, before returning to the subcommittee's own conclusion at the end. So we begin with the chapter's prologue and its deliberately plain heading, the 10 words that settled an argument before it started. Everything that follows is measured against those 10 words. Some of what we look at holds up under them. Much of it does not. And the measuring instrument is not ours. It was printed in full at the back of a United States Senate document, and we will come to that. Nuremberg, 1947. The doctor's trial was one of the 12 proceedings that followed the main tribunal, and its defendants were physicians. 3 American judges heard it: Walter Beals, Harold Sebring, and Johnson Crawford. What they produced at the end was not only a set of convictions. It was 10 numbered principles, set down as the standard the defendants had violated and the standard by which any future experiment on a human being should be judged. Count them. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. 10 words, and not one of them hedged. There is no exception for urgency, none for institutions, none for people already in custody or care. Consent is principle 1, and the other 9 build outward from it. Minimize suffering, use qualified personnel, let the subject withdraw at any time, avoid unnecessary physical and mental injury. Keep that list in mind, we will use it. Where a rule is written changes what it is. The Nuremberg Code was not an essay in medical philosophy. It was not a professional association's aspirational guideline, and it was not a hospital's internal policy that an administrator could revise. It was written into a war crimes verdict against named defendants as the law's answer to what the court had just proved. That is the strongest place a rule about human experiments has ever been put. Move forward 27 years. By 1974, the Nuremberg Code had been reprinted in full as Appendix 6A to a document of the United States Senate. The Staff Study Individual Rights and the Federal Role in Behavior Modification, prepared for the Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights under Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina. Pended is the wrong word for it. The subcommittee did not file the code away. It used it as a yardstick. Set the dates side by side. The code is written in 1947. The seed opens in Dade County, Florida, in 1970. The Veterans Administration issues its Psychosurgery circular in 1973. The Senate study prints the code in 1974. And in 1977, the World Psychiatric Association, meeting in Honolulu, formally condemned the political misuse of psychiatry. The standard and the failures were contemporaries. That is the uncomfortable part. Here is the claim this chapter actually makes, stated as narrowly as its author states it. Not that psychiatry is inherently a weapon. Rather, that in program after program, in the very same years, the vocabulary of treatment, consent, and care was detached from its ethical foundations and redeployed as an instrument of social control, and that this happened in multiple unrelated settings, visible only once the documents are laid side by side. The first case study opens in Dade County, Florida in 1970 with a program called The Seed. Its premise was starkly counterintuitive, that adolescent drug use could be cured by first dismantling the teenagers' relationships with their actual family, then building a substitute family out of staff and fellow participants. The staff were not, in the main, psychiatrists or clinical psychologists. Many were former users themselves, and they believed with the conviction of the converted. Referrals came through 3 doors: juvenile courts offering the seed instead of delinquency proceedings, schools identifying students with drug problems, and parents, hoping or desperate, with the legal authority to make a minor attend. For many of those teenagers, entry was not voluntary in any ordinary sense. They had not chosen to be there. They had been sent. Measure that against Principle 1, the voluntary consent of the human subject, and the distance is already visible. They had not chosen to be there. They had been sent. And once inside, the first thing the program removed was the family that sent them. Telephone calls were prohibited. Letters were intercepted. Visits were suspended, at first for days, then for weeks. When contact with parents resumed, it resumed as a privilege earned through demonstrated progress, not as a right a child simply holds. The severance was immediate, and it was deliberate. The rationale appeared plainly in the program's own materials, and it was therapeutic. The old relationships had helped produce the addiction. They had enabled it through denial or neglect or simple lack of structure. So they had to be suspended before genuine recovery could begin. Read that twice. It is not a confession of cruelty. It is a treatment theory, and the whole difficulty of this chapter lives in the distance between the two. Notice the vocabulary because every word was chosen. Staff were not staff. They were the family. The facility was not a facility. It was a home. The other adolescents were not fellow patients. They were brothers and sisters. Progress came in levels. The goal, spoken aloud, was surrender. Language did the heavy work here. It replaced one family with another, and it made that substitution feel like love rather than coercion. So who held authority over a 14-year-old inside the seed? Staff and senior participants, meaning teenagers who had been there longer and climbed higher through the levels. They judged progress. They granted privileges. They decided when a child could speak to their own mother again. That is an extraordinary amount of power to place in the hands of adolescents and untrained counselors, and the program placed it there deliberately by design. Laid out as a sequence, the structure is easy to follow. Contact is severed. A substitute family is installed in its place. Progress is judged by that substitute family, against criteria it sets itself. And contact with the real family returns only as a reward for progress those same people define. Each step is defensible on its own. Assembled, they make the program the only road back to a child's mother. The knowledge base entry on Singer's conditions for thought reform calls isolation a critical component of coercive persuasion. Control someone's environment and social contacts, and the group becomes their only source of validation, information, and emotional support. That passage was written about coercive groups in general, not about this Florida program, and I want to be careful with it. But the structural fit is uncomfortable, and reviewers later noticed the same outline. And the sessions at the center of it all were run not by licensed clinicians but by former drug users working as peer counselors. Their credential was their own recovery story. Not a degree in psychology, not training in counseling, not a background in adolescent development. A story told convincingly about having come back. Depending where you stand, that is either the program's greatest strength or its deepest structural weakness. Take both sides seriously because both are real. Peer counselors had credibility that professionals often lacked. They spoke the language of the street, and their authority came from having survived the thing rather than having studied it. But they lacked the training to see a session crossing from confrontation into harm, to recognize psychological deterioration, or to exercise the judgment professional ethics demands about when a session must stop. That gap is structural, not moral. Let me be as clear as I know how to be. Mental illness is real. Psychiatric treatment helps enormous numbers of people every single day, including people watching this. Nothing in this episode is a reason to stop a prescribed medication, cancel an appointment, or avoid care. If you are in crisis, please reach out to a doctor, a crisis line, someone you trust. What we examine here is one program's design. At the center of a day at the seed sat the RAP, the program's core therapeutic instrument. The word sounds casual. The thing was not. A newcomer took a chair facing the assembled group, and the group confronted them about drug use, about denial, about resistance to the program, about anything the group judged relevant to recovery. Sometimes for 12 hours or more in one sitting before the same faces hour after hour. The newcomer was expected to confess, to admit drug use, then to admit more than drug use, to drop every defense and let the group's collective pressure break through. Confess fully, accept criticism without arguing, demonstrate what the program called surrender, a word chosen deliberately for its therapeutic and religious weight, and you earned praise, privileges, and eventually your family back. Resist, deny, or minimize, and you stayed in the chair. Here is the gap this whole chapter turns on. For a federal reviewer reading a grant file, the rap could be written in clinical language. A confrontation session, a therapeutic community, a peer-based intervention. For a 15-year-old in that chair at hour 6, exhausted, humiliated, cut off from her parents, uncertain whether she would ever be allowed to leave, it was something else entirely. Same practice, 2 vocabularies. Only one reached Washington. The knowledge base defines the weaponization of psychiatry by intent. The primary goal is not patient health, but social control, punishment, or discreditation. Hold the seed against that test honestly, and it does not cleanly fit. Most people running that program appear to have believed they were saving children. That is the harder version of this story. Not villains, but a method producing coercion while everyone involved sincerely called it care. The peer structure mattered enormously, both to the design and later to the defense. Staff could describe the sessions as organic group process rather than imposed discipline. They were merely facilitating. The group did the therapeutic work. But the outcomes that group was expected to produce, confession, compliance, surrender, were set from above, not negotiated. Staff decided who advanced. The group's power was granted by staff and could be taken back. 12 hours or more. That is the figure most consistently attached to a single day's confrontation session at the seed, drawn from accounts by former participants that made their way into the federal review process. It deserves caution and weight at the same time, and I want to give it both in that order because how you handle a number like this is the difference between documentation and polemic, and this series stays on the documentation side. Caution first. These are reported figures from participant accounts, not entries in a controlled administrative log. Any single number will vary by intake group, by time period, and by who is remembering it. People recounting an experience years afterwards may compress a timeline or stretch it, and one account's 12 hours should not be read as universal practice across every session the program ever ran. There, the evidence genuinely thins. Now the weight. Federal reviewers examining the program did not treat that duration as an exaggeration or an isolated anecdote. They flagged it as a recurring characteristic, significant enough to record in a formal advisability assessment. A bureaucracy does not usually write a number into a review document unless it believes the number means something. Its presence there tells us reviewers themselves considered it substantiated enough to cite. That is corroboration, not proof. A 12-hour session leaves room for nothing else. Sleep compresses because the session begins early and runs late. Schoolwork, if the program provides any, shrinks or disappears. Meals at normal hours, breaks for rest, the natural ebb and flow of a group's energy. All unavailable. That compression is not incidental to how confrontation therapy works. Extended duration is itself part of the mechanism, and the designers understood that perfectly well. 1 hour lets a subject hold their defenses and wait out the clock. 12 makes that impossible. Now the inference, and I am labeling it, these are the same levers the coercive interrogation model relied on, which this series examined earlier. Fatigue, isolation from support, comforts withheld, relief promised for confession. No inquiry found borrowing. And note the effect. Distress produced by the method reads, inside the file as illness. Say it again plainly. Nothing here is a reason to stop a prescribed medication, to skip an appointment, or to avoid help. If you are struggling tonight, reach out to someone. The people applying these methods may sincerely have believed they were helping addicted teenagers. The people subjected to them experienced something different. Next, we lay 3 documents side by side: a grant request, a review, and a letter that changes the subject. Leave the chair now and leave the room. The teenager sitting through the 6th hour of a confrontation session does not appear in what comes next. What comes next is paperwork. 3 documents produced by adults in offices hundreds of miles away, over roughly 18 months. Lay them side by side and you can watch a federal bureaucracy conduct an argument with itself in writing and lose it. None of the 3 is secret. Here is the sequence. In June 1972, a grant request travels from a Florida drug program to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. 5 months later, the same department commissions a study asking whether the program it had just funded was advisable at all. In February 1974, the program's president writes to defend himself. And that same year, a Senate subcommittee files all 3 into a single appendix, where they still sit. The first document is dated the 20th of June, 1972. A grant request submitted to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, the federal agency then responsible for drug treatment funding, among a wide portfolio of social programs. This pitch is confident. The seed is a national model. It works, it is inexpensive, and it can be copied anywhere. Read it alone and you would fund it too. That is the point of a grant request. The cost efficiency rests on one substitution. Licensed clinicians are expensive. Former drug users working as peer counselors are not. That single line in the budget is what makes the program replicable, and it is the same line that the reviewers would later worry about. The request does not present it as a risk. Presents it as the innovation. Cheapness and method are, in this file, the same sentence. That matters 5 months later. What does the request promise? Graduates who have stayed off drugs. Families, it says, were reunited. A program that, in its own telling, works. Notice the shape of those claims. All of them are outcomes, and none of them is a method. Nothing in the request describes what a 12-hour session actually involves. That omission is not yet suspicious. It becomes significant only when the same omission appears again, under direct questioning. 5 months. That is the gap between the grant request being funded and the same department commissioning a study asking whether the program was advisable at all. 5 months is very fast. Federal agencies do not usually interrogate a decision they have only just made. The timing strongly suggests that someone, inside the department, or outside it with access to its processes, had raised a concern about what was happening inside the seed's walls. The second document is the advisability study, commissioned in November 1972. Its remit was narrow and pointed. Examine the program's clinical methods, and examine the qualifications of the staff running its core sessions. On both counts, the reviewers found real questions. Extended confrontation sessions, run by uncredentialed former drug users, did not clearly meet any recognizable clinical standard. That is the federal government's own language about a program the federal government was paying for. One thing must be said plainly here, and it will be said again. A federal review finding that 1 program sessions were run by untrained staff is not a claim about psychiatry, about psychiatrists, or about treatment. Mental illness is real. Psychiatric care helps an enormous number of people every day. Nothing in this episode is a reason to stop a prescribed medication, cancel an appointment, or avoid asking for help. 3 concerns, specifically. First, method. 12-hour confrontation sessions led by people credentialed only by their own recovery. Second, oversight. The staff who ran the sessions were essentially the same people responsible for monitoring their quality, so a session that went too far had nobody outside it to notice. Third, consent. For adolescents referred by courts and schools rather than walking in themselves, the reviewers judged consent ambiguous at best. That is a serious list. Having written all of that down, the advisability study recommended that funding continue. Doubt, followed by continuation. That sequence is the quietly damning part of the whole file, because it is not a story about officials failing to notice a problem. It is a story about officials noticing a problem, writing it into the federal record, and then proceeding as though the problem could be managed without interrupting the money. Nobody hid anything. Set the two halves side by side. On one side, the findings, methods that met no recognizable clinical standard, oversight that amounted to self-monitoring, consent that was ambiguous for the very teenagers least able to refuse. On the other side, the recommendation, keep paying. Nothing was suspended. Nothing was stopped. The concerns were entered into the record and the record moved on without them, which is a different failure from ignorance. Why does a single administrative sentence deserve this much attention? Because it establishes something about timing. The questions this episode asks were not invented decades later by critics with hindsight. They were asked in real time in writing by the government that was funding the answer, and then preserved by a Senate subcommittee 18 months on. Whatever else is arguable here, that much is a matter of record. It is not a reconstruction. The third document is a letter, dated the 19th of February, 1974, from the SEED's own president to the department that funded it. The date matters. By then, the Senate Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights was actively compiling its behavior modification file, and a program under congressional scrutiny had every reason to put its best case on paper before the subcommittee's report reached print. The letter survives in the record as Appendix 1C. The letter mounts a specific kind of defense. It rests on results. Graduates who stayed off drugs, it names numbers. Families reunited, it names outcomes. What it conspicuously never does is engage the concerns the advisability study had raised 15 months earlier. Not consent. Not oversight. Not whether 12-hour sessions run by uncredentialed counselors amount to therapy in any clinical sense. That change is the whole letter. Here is the subcommittee's quiet verdict. It did not print the president's letter as a rebuttal to the critical study. It filed the letter beside it in one appendix of the 1974 staff study, Individual Rights and the Federal Role in Behavior Modification, a document held in the TI One Voice knowledge base, and let a reader compare the two. That placement reads as a judgment. The file does the work. Second time, and it matters more than anything else in this episode. If you are watching while distressed, isolated, or unsure who to believe, please hear this. Nothing in a 1972 funding file tells you anything about your own care. Do not stop a prescribed medication because of a documentary. If you are in crisis tonight, contact emergency services, a crisis line, or one person you trust. Asking for help is not surrender. Step back from the individual pages and the shape is simple enough to name in 3 words. Fund. Question. Continue. The government paid for methods already known to be unconventional. It then studied its own decision, found reasons for concern, and kept paying. When a Senate subcommittee began asking, the program answered with outcomes and said nothing about method. Then the whole sequence was filed, and there it stopped. It is still there. It would be easier if this were a story about one bad actor concealing wrongdoing. It is not. Every stage worked roughly as an oversight system is supposed to work. The information was collected. The concerns were written down. The review was commissioned, conducted, and published. And the funding continued. A machine that documents its own doubts and never acts on them is, in its way, the more troubling result. Nobody has to lie. Now the inference labeled as 1. The TI One Voice knowledge base defines the weaponization of psychiatry narrowly. The psychiatric system used for ends outside medicine, control, punishment, discredit. Its own entry stresses non-therapeutic intent. That definition does not describe ordinary clinical work, and it is not evidence about anybody's diagnosis. It describes what becomes possible when a complaint can be received as a symptom, and nobody is required to check. That is a narrow claim. The SEEDS file closes here, unresolved, exactly as the subcommittee left it. But the same appendix holds a second kind of document. The knowledge base's entry on psychosurgery calls it one of psychiatry's most desperate therapeutic gambles, and in 1973 the Veterans Administration issued a circular titled Plainly Surgery for Abnormal Behavior. Same vocabulary of consent and review. Only now the procedure is irreversible and performed on the brain. That comes next. The SEED file closes with a question unresolved, and the subcommittee's appendix simply continues. The next documents in the same folder are not about a drug program for teenagers. They are about brain surgery. The staff who had been reading grant requests and advisability studies now turned to a Veterans Administration circular, a Harvard neurosurgeon's testimony, and a technical vocabulary designed to describe the destruction of living tissue calmly, as if it were routine. In 1973, the Veterans Administration issued a circular titled, "And the Plainness Matters, Surgery for Abnormal Behavior," with the word psychosurgery in brackets after it. Read that slowly. Not surgery for a tumor. Not surgery for an injury. Surgery for behavior an institution had classified as abnormal, performed on former servicemen inside hospitals the agency ran. The title is itself a piece of evidence. The circular existed because the practice already did. Psychosurgery means the deliberate, irreversible lesioning of healthy brain tissue in order to change behavior, emotion, or personality. That is the distinction that matters. Surgery for a tumor or an aneurysm removes something pathological you can point to on a scan. Psychosurgery removes tissue that is not diseased in order to change who the patient is. The knowledge base entry on psychosurgery calls it psychiatry's most desperate therapeutic gamble, and a cautionary tale about medicine and state power. Why does a circular like this get written? Because something is already happening that needs rules. The agency had concluded, correctly, that irreversible brain surgery performed to change a patient's temperament required written safeguards around who could authorize it and under what conditions. A rule is a response. The existence of this one tells you that, before 1973, those decisions were being made without any special procedure at all. The chapter makes a sharp observation here. In the absence of a circular, whether to open a patient's skull and destroy tissue in order to calm him had apparently been handled by ordinary hospital consent procedures, the same forms used for a tonsillectomy or a hernia repair, as though the two categories of operation were comparable. One is reversible and routine. The other permanently changes a person. The paperwork did not distinguish them. On paper, the standard was genuinely demanding. Consent had to be informed, explained, and actually understood, not merely signed. It had to be voluntary, free of pressure from staff, from family, and from an institution that controlled the patient's daily life and eventual release. And the decision had to be reviewed by someone outside the surgeon's own service, so that the person proposing the operation was not also the person approving it. The circular also forbade any emergency exception, and that provision is more important than it looks. An emergency clause, the power to bypass consent and review when a situation is judged urgent, is the standard back door through which protective rules are quietly rendered inoperative. By refusing to write one, the Veterans Administration was saying that psychosurgery is so permanent that no circumstance whatsoever justifies proceeding without the full safeguards in place. Here is the problem the circular could not solve with words. The patients it protected were confined inside the system proposing the surgery. Their release depended on the same clinical judgment recommending it. A signature, an interview with an independent reviewer, a note that the risks were understood. All of that can coexist with a decision shaped by the knowledge that appearing cooperative is the surest route to the exit the institution controls. One thing must be said plainly, and it will be said again. This is history, a specific practice in specific institutions in the 1970s that medicine itself stopped. It is not an argument that mental illness is imaginary, that diagnoses are generally wrong, or that treatment is dangerous. Mental illness is real. Treatment helps enormous numbers of people. If you are in crisis tonight, please reach out for help. Back to the record. On the 23rd of May, 1972, Dr. William H. Sweet, a Harvard neurosurgeon, appeared before a Labor and Health, Education, and Welfare Appropriations Subcommittee of the United States Congress. He was there to defend one thing: continued federal funding for psychosurgery research. Sweet was not a marginal figure. He was, by then, the public face of the argument that this was legitimate, scientifically grounded medicine, deserving the same support as any other neuroscience. Sweet's standing came partly from a book. In 1970 he co-authored Violence and the Brain with Vernon Mark and Frank Irvin, a book this series examined earlier. Its argument was that some episodes of uncontrolled violence begin in identifiable dysfunction deep in the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, and that lesioning the affected tissue could treat the behavior itself rather than merely managing its consequences. That claim was contested from the start. What makes that testimony striking is not what Sweet said but where it landed. In the same year, in the same building, the Senate Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights was examining the same research and asking a completely different question. Sweet argued psychosurgery deserved money because it might help patients. The subcommittee asked whether the patients who might be helped had consented, and whether they were even in a position to consent. The two arguments never met. One committee funded the work, another investigated it, and the staff of neither had a complete picture of the other's file. That is a finding about fragmentation, not conspiracy. The knowledge base records that Sweet also made his case publicly, presenting on psychosurgery at an American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting in Boston, where he addressed the ethical controversy surrounding lobotomy directly. He was defending a practice in the open. The critics were heard too. The knowledge-based summary of the 1974 behavior modification hearings records testimony that amygdalotomies and cingulotomies had been performed on prisoners and mental patients to control aggression, often without informed consent, that the procedures were irreversible, carried real risk of cognitive impairment, and rested on dubious scientific grounds. It is the sentence the whole chapter turns on, and the subcommittee did not soften it. A short glossary is necessary, because this field carries a technical vocabulary that can obscure how consequential the procedures were. Amygdalotomy names the technique that targets the amygdala, a small region deep in the temporal lobe tied to fear and aggression, the procedure most directly at issue in the Kamowitz case and in the subcommittee's psychosurgery appendix. Cingulotomy and hypothalamotomy name related operations on different structures. Each one destroys tissue that cannot grow back. Lobotomy is the cruder, earlier precedent, the operation Walter Freeman performed with an ice pick-like instrument through the eye socket, severing connections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain. The knowledge base notes that the prefrontal lobotomy earned its developer a Nobel Prize before being condemned for catastrophic personality change. By the mid-50s it had fallen from favor, but it shaped how Congress and the public understood every psychiatric brain operation that followed. Notice what that vocabulary does. It is clinical, precise, and, to an untrained ear, anesthetic words that describe the destruction of brain tissue in the same neutral register a repair manual uses for a worn part. That anesthesia, the power of technical language to make the irreversible sound routine, is part of the story. By filing the circular, the testimony, and the literature together, the subcommittee was asking a question. Set it out in order and the arc is visible. What reformed after this is genuine, and it matters. The National Research Act of 1974 created the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects, which reported on psychosurgery in 1977 and built the review board system that governs research on people today. Medicine did not need outsiders to expose this. Its own bodies did the work. That is the record. Second time and deliberately. Nothing in this episode is a reason to stop a prescribed medication, cancel an appointment, or avoid a doctor. Do not stop treatment because of anything you hear here. If you are frightened, exhausted, or thinking about harming yourself, contact a doctor or a crisis line tonight. The abuses in this record were exposed by clinicians and stopped by medicine's own institutions. Care is not the enemy. Here is the inference, labeled as inference. If a complaint can be recorded as a symptom, that one category of report becomes impossible to verify from inside the institution hearing it. That is a structural observation about confinement and consent. It is not a claim about any clinician, any diagnosis, or any viewer. Next, the same structure appears in its most fully developed form, in Moscow with a diagnosis invented for dissenters. The subcommittee's question hangs there, unanswered by any glossary. When does clinical precision become a way of not seeing what is being done? To answer it, the record has to leave Washington. The 1974 Senate study examined American programs only. Its scope stopped at the border. But in exactly those years, another country was building the most fully documented case of psychiatry turned to political ends, and its shape explains something the American files could not. Nothing about that comparison implies the two systems were equivalent. They were not. The United States had courts, a free press, and a Senate willing to publish what it found. What the Soviet case offers is clarity. The same structural machinery running without any of those checks so that its parts are visible. Historians and the profession itself have described it in detail. We report it precisely, and we stop where the documents stop. One thing must be said plainly before we go further, and it will be said again. Mental illness is real. It causes enormous suffering, and treatment helps a great many people live well. Nothing in this episode is a reason to stop a prescribed medication, cancel an appointment, or avoid a doctor. What follows is a history of political misuse by particular states, documented and condemned by psychiatrists themselves. It is not a verdict on care. The practice rested on one diagnostic invention. Through the 1960s and 70s, psychiatrists at the Serbsky Institute for Forensic Psychiatry in Moscow developed a category with no exact Western equivalent: sluggish schizophrenia, sometimes translated as creeping or slow progressing. By the Brezhnev years, the Serbsky had become the central place where political cases were processed. The knowledge base entry on the Declaration of Hawaii describes it as notorious for producing diagnoses that effectively criminalized dissent. What made the category usable was its vagueness. Ordinary schizophrenia, as Western psychiatry defined it, required hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thought. Sluggish schizophrenia required none of those. A knowledge base article on the Soviet exposure records the listed symptoms: reformist delusions, overvalued ideas about social justice, a pathological preoccupation with human rights. Read those aloud and the mechanism is obvious. The criteria were written wide enough to catch a person who had committed no medical symptom at all. So what did the diagnosed actually do? They dissented from official ideology. They passed prohibited literature hand to hand. They formed independent groups or worshipped outside the state-approved churches, or simply declined to behave as Soviet life expected. None of that is a symptom. Each of them was, in the state's arrangement, sufficient. This is documented history, catalogued by human rights monitors at the time and by the profession's own inquiries afterwards. Hold that sentence a moment. It is not describing a person hearing voices. It is describing a person who wants reform, who cares about fairness, who will not let a rights case drop. The knowledge base article notes that the label could be applied to people showing no overt psychotic symptoms at all, on the theory that the illness was latent. A theory unfalsifiable by design is not a diagnosis. The best-known case has a name. In 1970, The biologist Jures Medvedev was forcibly hospitalized after writing critically about the Soviet scientific establishment. His brother, the historian Roy Medvedev, carried the case to the West. Scientists and writers abroad campaigned, and the campaign worked. Medvedev was released. That outcome is important for a reason easy to miss. It took an international public applying sustained pressure to undo a single diagnosis. Medvedev was not alone, and the others are named in the record too. The human rights activist Vladimir Bukovsky, the mathematician Leonid Plyush, the poet Natalia Gorbanevskaya, arrested after the Red Square protest of 1968. The Ukrainian dissident Vyacheslav Kornevil. Behind those four stand dozens of others whose names never traveled abroad, diagnosed, hospitalized, and in many cases medicated by force with drugs whose effects on the body were severe and entirely real. Where were they held? In a network called Special Psychiatric Hospitals, and the crucial fact is administrative. Ordinary psychiatric care sat under the Ministry of Health. The special hospitals did not. They were run by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the agency responsible for police, prisons, and internal security. That placement is a confession in a filing cabinet. These were not medical facilities that drifted into misuse. They were security facilities employing medicine. Conditions inside were, by every reliable account, brutal, and one feature mattered more than the walls. Once the diagnosis was applied, it was almost impossible to remove, because protest against it counted as proof of it. Objecting showed lack of insight. Refusing the drugs showed resistance to treatment. Insisting you were sane demonstrated how sick you were. The loop closes, and the person inside it has no move. That is not a symptom. Forced medication was routine, and here precision matters because it protects everyone. Antipsychotic drugs, prescribed carefully and with consent, relieve terrible suffering for many people every day. What happened in the special hospitals was different in kind. High doses imposed without consent, producing rigidity, tremor, lethargy, and dulled thought. The wrong is coercion, not chemistry. Say it the other way and you would harm exactly the people this history should protect. The profession did act, and the dates deserve to be kept straight. In 1977, at its 6th World Congress in Honolulu, the World Psychiatric Association formally condemned the Soviet abuse, the first time an international medical body had censured one of its own member organizations. In 1983, the Soviet Association withdrew rather than face expulsion. It was readmitted in 1989, after perestroika and glasnost began dismantling the system. Two readings of that sequence are both true. The first is creditable. Psychiatrists, organized as a profession, judged colleagues abroad and named the abuse in public. The second is sobering. Condemnation took roughly a decade of campaigning by dissidents, exiles, and Western doctors, and the Soviet establishment resisted every step of it. Institutions rarely correct themselves from the inside. They correct when outsiders make the cost of not correcting unbearable. Strip the Soviet case to its structure and three elements remain. First, a diagnostic category elastic enough to catch conduct that is unacceptable politically rather than pathological medically. Second, the authority to confine, resting on that judgment. Third, the vocabulary of treatment which supplies moral cover, forced medication called therapy, confinement called care. Wherever the power to diagnose and the power to detain converge, those three parts exist and have to be watched. Watched is the operative word, and modern practice was rebuilt around it. Commitment law now requires courts, time limits, and independent review. Ethics codes adopted after Honolulu bind psychiatrists to refuse treatment where there is no illness. Advocates, second opinions, and appeal rights exist precisely because this history happened. Those safeguards are imperfect and unevenly enforced. They are also real, and they are the reason the Soviet arrangement is not the ordinary condition of psychiatry. This is the second time we are saying it, and it matters more than anything else here. If you are struggling, get help. Keep taking what your doctor prescribed unless your doctor tells you otherwise. If you are in crisis tonight, call your emergency number or a crisis line and tell someone you trust. Nothing in this history says your clinician is an adversary or your diagnosis was political. We do not make that claim about anyone. Now the inference labeled as one. Knowledge-based material notes that literature about targeted individuals draws a parallel between the Soviet diagnosis and the modern dismissal of people who report organized harassment. As a structural observation, the parallel holds. A complaint treated as a symptom cannot be investigated. As a claim about anyone's actual case, it proves nothing whatsoever. Parallel is a shape, not evidence. Here the documentation ends and honest reasoning has to stop. What became of the practice? Knowledge-based sources record that after the Soviet collapse, the systematic weaponization in Russia declined sharply, with isolated cases still reported. In China, documented instances involve petitioners and activists rather than a nationwide apparatus. The category itself is gone from mainstream diagnostic manuals. The condition that permitted it is not gone anywhere. Closed institutions, weak review, and a diagnosis that no one inside can effectively contest. Which returns us to Washington, and to the question the Senate subcommittee could not avoid. Its investigators were not looking at Soviet-style repression. They were looking at token economies, aversive conditioning, and a psychosurgery ward. But the Soviet case made the underlying question unignorable. When may a state, speaking in the vocabulary of medicine, alter the thoughts and personality of people it holds? Next we take that question back inside the American record. Those three elements, an elastic diagnosis, the power to confine, and the vocabulary of treatment were not unique to Moscow. Within the behavior modification debates this chapter has been tracing, one American diagnostic category shows the problem with unusual clarity. It was called discontrol syndrome. Understanding what was proposed under that name, and what was not established, tells us more about how a label acquires power than any argument about psychiatry in general. In 1970, the neurosurgeon Vernon Mark and the psychiatrist Frank Ervin published a book called Violence and the Brain. Their proposal was specific. Some repeatedly violent people, they argued, were acting not from psychology or circumstance but from abnormal electrical activity in the limbic system, violence as a kind of seizure. If the focus of that activity could be located, it could be removed. They called the pattern discontrol syndrome, and they meant it as medicine. Be precise about what was shown and what was not. Mark and Ervin documented real cases in which temporal lobe damage and violent episodes occurred together. That correlation was genuine. What did not exist then or now was a validated biological marker for dangerousness, a test that could take a person who had harmed nobody and identify them as organically violent. The category reached past its evidence. The reach, not the neurology, is the problem. Now set that against the moment. The urban unrest of the late 1960s was also being explained by a large body of social science as a rational response to racism, poverty, and political exclusion. Two accounts of the same violence. One locates the cause inside a person's brain and the answer in surgery. The other locates it in conditions and the answer in political change. Both cannot organize policy at once. Psychosurgery had faded in the mid-1950s, as the first antipsychotic drugs arrived and enthusiasm for lobotomy collapsed. The 1974 Senate study recorded its return, and the appendices tell you why the subcommittee was watching. A statement from the National Institute of Neurological Diseases and Stroke in October 1973, and a psychosurgery report from the National Institute of Mental Health in January 1974. Both are in the knowledge base. The subcommittee also tracked money. Federal research funding was shifting away from general medical questions toward the reduction of violence, and that shift is what the senators flagged. Here is the careful version of the argument, and it matters. A convenient explanation is not automatically a false one, but an explanation that relieves institutions of responsibility and attracts money for doing so, deserves harder scrutiny than one that does not. That is context, not accusation. Stop for a moment because this needs saying without hedging. Mental illness is real. Psychiatric treatment helps an enormous number of people live better lives, and for some of them it is the difference between living and not. Nothing in this history is a reason to stop a prescribed medication, cancel an appointment, or avoid a doctor. If you are in crisis tonight, contact a clinician or an emergency service where you live. Now the structural point, which is the heart of this section. A person is confined on the basis of a diagnosis. Their behavior in confinement is then read as confirming it. Protest against the diagnosis becomes lack of insight. Refusal of treatment becomes non-compliance. Every move available to the person inside the loop is already coded as a symptom, and the body evaluating the evidence is the body that produced it. In Soviet special hospitals, that loop was explicit. In American institutions, it appeared in weaker, less systematic forms. A committed patient who refused medication was non-compliant, which could be read as continuing illness, which could justify continuing confinement. A prisoner who declined Project START was resisting rehabilitation, and that could be written into a parole file. A New York Bar Association report in the knowledge base extends the same worry to brain scans. That sentence is from this series' own source text, and it describes a structure, not a conspiracy. Mark the boundary carefully because this is the point where careless reasoning does damage. That a complaint can be received as a symptom is an observation about institutions. It is not evidence that any particular report was true, that any particular clinician acted wrongly, or that anyone's diagnosis was politically arranged. That step is inference, not fact. And notice what the loop does not require. It does not require a corrupt doctor, a secret instruction, or anyone acting in bad faith. Good clinicians, working carefully, inside rules written to protect patients, can still produce a situation in which a labeled person cannot contest the label without appearing to confirm it. That is an argument about institutional design. It is not an argument against the people who work inside them. Why was the Soviet system the pure case? Because three conditions converged that are usually kept apart. A state with no independent judiciary. A psychiatric profession with no meaningful autonomy from that state. And a network of special hospitals run not by the health ministry but by the internal security apparatus. Remove any one of the three and the machine loses a wheel. In Moscow, all three turned together for the better part of 30 years. The diagnostic instrument was sluggish schizophrenia, developed at the Serbsky Institute for Forensic Psychiatry in Moscow, alongside a companion category sometimes rendered as reformist delusions. The knowledge base notes the second term as well as the first. The hospitals were administered by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Police, Prisons, Internal Security, which is not a detail but a confession. These were security facilities that employed doctors, not hospitals that security had borrowed. Here is the difference that mattered most. In the United States, a court could intervene. In Alabama in 1971, Wyatt against Stickney established minimum standards for people held in state institutions. In Michigan in 1973, the Kamowitz ruling held that a man confined indefinitely could not give free consent to experimental psychosurgery. Nobody in the Soviet Union needed to fear a Wyatt or a Kamowitz, because such courts did not exist. Notice who did the condemning. In 1977, the World Psychiatric Association adopted the Declaration of Hawaii at its Honolulu Congress, setting out that psychiatric skills must never be used to detain someone who is not ill. The Soviet Association withdrew in 1983 rather than face expulsion and returned in 1989. Psychiatry's own institutions wrote the rules that named this abuse. That is worth holding onto as this section continues. The Soviet Union was the most famous case, not the only one. In apartheid South Africa, political detainees were diagnosed with mental illness and treated, including, in documented cases, with electroconvulsive therapy used as punishment rather than medicine. Two hierarchies reinforced each other: the racial hierarchy of apartheid and the clinical hierarchy of the ward. The profession was overwhelmingly white, the patients frequently black, and the distance between them made a diagnosis harder to challenge. In the People's Republic of China, political dissent was pathologized during the Cultural Revolution and after. The knowledge base records forced hospitalization of Falun Gong practitioners into the 1990s and 2000s, and notes that the World Psychiatric Association sought to investigate and met resistance, with the Chinese Psychiatric Association denying that abuse occurred. Say plainly what that means. The Chinese record is thinner than the Soviet one, because access was restricted. Here the evidence narrows. Second time, because once is not enough. This episode is about states, institutions, and dates. It is not about you. Nothing here says that diagnoses are generally false, that clinicians are adversaries, or that any particular person's diagnosis was politically arranged. We will never tell you what is happening to you. If you are unwell, get care. If you are frightened tonight, tell someone tonight. Those two sentences are the important ones. In the West, the pattern appeared in legally different but functionally similar forms. Some American anti-war activists were psychiatrically confined in the late 1960s and early 70s, through worried parents, emergency commitment orders, and the wide discretion of psychiatric emergency rooms. No central authority ordered it. One knowledge-based document asserts a conspiracy between psychiatry and police across Western states. That is an advocacy conclusion. The record supports individual cases, not a coordinated system. So the line between someone who is ill and someone whose politics their family finds unacceptable was, in practice, never as bright as the law required. That is the honest end of this section. What follows asks how far the comparison can be pushed, from a Moscow special hospital to a drug program in Miami, and then hands the question to psychiatry's fiercest internal critic, a professor of psychiatry named Thomas Zaz. Before we go further, a warning about our own argument. It would be historically inaccurate and analytically sloppy to treat the Soviet Special Psychiatric Hospital and a Florida drug program for teenagers as the same thing. They are not. One was an instrument of a police state. The other was a civilian treatment program run by former addicts. Saying so is not a concession. It is the precondition for the point that follows. Set them side by side and the differences are enormous. The Soviet Special Hospital was operated by the secret police, and it took people for what they said and believed. The Seed in Dade County was operated by former addicts, and it took teenagers for something they were actually doing, using drugs destructively in ways many of them later agreed had to stop. Different states, different motives, different centuries of assumption. Hold that distinction firmly. At one end sits the Special Psychiatric Hospital of the Soviet system, a closed institution, administered not by health ministries but by the state's security apparatus, receiving people whose offense was dissent. The World Psychiatric Association confronted that record openly, and in 1983 the Soviet Society resigned rather than face expulsion. That is documented history, condemned by psychiatry's own international body. It is the extreme case, and the extreme case is not the ordinary one. The Seed sits somewhere in the middle. Nobody sent teenagers there for their politics. Parents sent them because a child was using drugs, and that was true, and it was dangerous. What the 1974 Senate subcommittee questioned was not the goal but the method. Confinement, sleep restriction, public confession, and a consent that a 14-year-old could not meaningfully give or take back. Good intentions did not make the method voluntary. That is the whole of the finding. Picture it as a ladder rather than a category. At the bottom, an hour with a therapist you chose and can stop seeing tomorrow, the ordinary care that helps millions of people and that this series has no argument with whatsoever. Above that, programs entered under pressure. Above that, closed residential programs. At the top, detention by the state. Same vocabulary of treatment on every rung. Very different amounts of freedom. Now, plainly, because it matters more than any argument in this episode. Mental illness is real. Depression, psychosis, bipolar illness, and post-traumatic stress are real conditions that cause real suffering, and treatment helps a great many people live well. Nothing in this history is a reason to stop medication a doctor prescribed you, or to cancel an appointment, or to avoid care. If you are in crisis tonight, please reach out for help. So the question the subcommittee raised was never whether every program on that ladder is equivalent. They are not. The question was whether programs drift upward, from consensual toward coercive, when nobody is watching closely. Drift is the mechanism. A rule relaxes, a consent form thins, a locked door is added for safety, and the program arrives somewhere it never announced it was going. Oversight exists to notice the drift early. Which brings us to the man who asked that question loudest, and from the least likely address. No account of psychiatry's political misuse is complete without its most relentless internal critic. Not an activist outside the profession, not a journalist, but a tenured professor of psychiatry who spent 50 years arguing that his own discipline rested on a confusion. His name was Thomas Szasz. You do not have to agree with him to need him. The record is straightforward. Thomas Szasz was born in Budapest in 1920 and emigrated to the United States in 1938, as Europe closed around him. He trained as a physician at the University of Cincinnati and completed his psychiatric residency at the University of Chicago. From 1956 until he retired in 1990, he was a professor of psychiatry at the State University of New York Upstate Medical University in Syracuse. In 1961, the same year Irving Goffman published Asylums, Szasz published The Myth of Mental Illness. The title was deliberately provocative, and it was widely misread then and is still misread now. Szasz was not saying that suffering is fake, or that people who are terrified and sleepless are pretending. He was making a narrower claim about language, that the word illness was doing work it had not earned. His argument ran like this. In ordinary medicine, disease means a lesion, a structural or functional abnormality you can find in the body. Cancer has a tumor, heart disease has a blocked artery. Szasz argued that the mental disorders had no equivalent lesion, and so the judgment that a pattern of thought or conduct was pathological was a social and moral judgment wearing medical clothes. From there, his conclusions were radical. If mental illness is a metaphor, Szasz said, then involuntary commitment is not treatment but imprisonment without trial. Forced medication is not therapy but chemical restraint, and the diagnostic manual is not a description of nature but an instrument of authority. Those are his words for it, not ours, and they are contested fiercely by people with good reasons. Keep the attribution attached. This is one man's position, stated at its strongest. And notice where he was standing. Szasz was not writing from exile or from a pamphlet press. He held a chair at a state medical school, published under his own name, taught residents, and drew a salary from the profession he was attacking for 34 years. That is worth pausing on. The argument about psychiatric power was not smuggled in from outside. It was conducted in the faculty building, in print, in public. His colleagues did not let it stand, and their answer is strong. The brain is a physical organ. Thought, mood, and behavior are patterns of brain activity, and the fact that we cannot yet map the mechanism of schizophrenia does not mean there is none. In the 1800s, nobody could explain epilepsy either. That did not make epilepsy a social construct. It made it a disorder we had not understood yet. Szasz was not alone, and not identical with the others. The knowledge base entry on Ronald Lang records a Glasgow-trained psychiatrist whose experience of insulin chemotherapy during national service shaped his own revolt. Goffman, a sociologist, described the closed institution from the inside. They disagreed with each other constantly. What they shared was a period, the 1960s, in which psychiatry examined its own coercive powers more publicly than almost any other branch of medicine. The knowledge base article on the weaponization of psychiatry draws the line in one sentence, and it is the line this episode is built on. Legitimate practice is voluntary and evidence-based. Misuse is defined by non-therapeutic intent, where the aim is not the patient's health but control, punishment, or discrediting someone. The test is intent and consent, not the diagnosis, not the medication, and never the person who is receiving the care. Second time, deliberately. Nothing in Zaz and nothing in this chapter is advice to you about your own care. His critics were right that abolishing every coercive power would leave some very ill people to deteriorate alone. If you have a diagnosis, this episode is not telling you it was wrong. If you have a prescription, keep taking it. If tonight is bad, call someone you trust or a crisis line. Please do. Here is the structural point, and it can be made without blaming a single clinician. If a particular kind of complaint is heard first as a symptom, then reporting it becomes evidence for the diagnosis, and the report cannot function as a report. One category of claim becomes undetectable, not disproved, undetectable. That is a problem about how a system routes information. It is not a claim that anyone acted in bad faith. Strip away the libertarian politics Zaz brought with him, and a usable tool remains. Ask of any program, not any person. Who consented and could they refuse? Can the consent be withdrawn tomorrow? Who benefits, the patient or the institution? Is there a door in law and in practice? Who reviews the decision independently? Is any of it written down? Those questions are answerable. They are also exactly what the subcommittee asked. One caution before we go on. The knowledge base states it flatly. No documented direct connection has been established between Soviet-style psychiatric abuse and present-day targeting claims. The parallel is conceptual. Treat it as a question to investigate, not a conclusion already reached, which is what TI One Voice's declaration asks for. That reported phenomena warrant investigation. Hold the treatment or control question because next it is asked where the intervention cannot be undone. Take the frameworks as offered and apply it to the two programs that anchor this chapter. The seed called its 12-hour confrontation sessions therapy. Imagine a neutral observer in that room, watching a 15-year-old shouted at by a circle of peers for 6 or 10 or 12 hours with sleep, food and family contact withheld until the designated surrender arrives. Treatment or coercion? The honest answer depends entirely on whether the observer accepts the program's own framing. Now the same test applied to the scalpel. The Veterans Administration circular described its procedures as surgery for abnormal behavior. Ask a neutral observer what abnormality was being treated, and the circular's careful language does not always answer. Was it a diagnosed disease of the brain, or a pattern of institutional noncompliance the staff found inconvenient? The document, filed in the Senate Subcommittee's 1974 study, does not consistently draw that line. Zaz's critique does not require you to conclude that the seed was a prison, or that the surgeons acted in bad faith. It requires only 4 questions, asked of every program that calls itself treatment. Who decided this behavior needed changing? On whose authority? With what consent? And toward what end? These are the questions a vocabulary of care is very good at making it feel impolite to ask out loud. Ask those 4 questions of program after program, and the same answer keeps coming back. The institution decided. It decided on its own authority. Consent, where it existed, was structurally compromised. And the end being pursued was compliance. What makes that recurrence hard to shrug off is that it appears across drug programs, surgical wards and grant review offices that never spoke to one another. Separately, each is a story. Together, they are a pattern. It matters to say plainly what this framework is not. It is not a finding that anyone in a white coat was a villain. Many of the people running these programs believed they were helping, and some of them were. The test is aimed at institutions and their paperwork, not at individual clinicians. And it is a question, not a verdict. The answer has to be established case by case, from documents, not assumed in advance. Before this goes any further, one thing has to be said plainly, and it will be said again. Mental illness is real. It causes real suffering, and treatment, medication, therapy, a doctor who listens has given a great many people their lives back. Nothing in this episode is a reason to stop a prescription, skip an appointment, or avoid care. If you are struggling right now, please contact your doctor or a crisis line today. Which brings the chapter to a book. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, is in one sense an ordinary reference work, a catalog of recognized conditions, each with its criteria and its differential diagnosis. In another sense, it is a gatekeeper, and the two senses are not easy to separate. Understanding how the second grew out of the first is the next step in this chapter's argument. The first edition appeared in 1952, 106 disorders in a slim volume of 130 pages. The second, in 1968, listed 182. The third, published in 1980, the year after the Belmont Report and 6 years after the Senate Subcommittee's study, throughout the psychoanalytic framework entirely in favor of symptom checklists, meant to make diagnosis more consistent from one clinician to the next. That is the description. Here is the prescription. The manual decides for insurers which conditions are real enough to pay for. It decides for courts which conditions can support an involuntary commitment or an insanity defense. And it decides in clinics which patients are offered which treatments. A book that determines all three does not merely describe the landscape of mental disorder. It shapes it because everyone else organizes their work around its categories. 106 disorders in 1952. Every edition since has added more. It would be lazy to read that growth as proof of anything on its own. Some editions corrected real omissions, conditions that existed and were being missed. But every edition also does something structural. It enlarges the population a system is authorized to act upon. Both things can be true at once, and which one applies has to be argued category by category. The clearest documented case is also the most famous. Homosexuality was listed as a mental disorder in the manual's first two editions. In 1973, after sustained pressure from gay rights activists, the American Psychiatric Association removed it, and the decision was confirmed by a vote of the association's membership. Note who corrected this. Not a congressional committee, not a journalist, but the profession itself in public, recognizing a social judgment recorded as medical fact. The same logic, in a much milder form, reaches other categories. The chapter names three: oppositional defiant disorder, which draws a line through childhood disobedience; social anxiety disorder, which draws one through shyness; and the personality disorders, whose criteria require a cultural judgment about what a normal personality looks like. Be careful here. Saying a boundary requires judgment is not saying the condition behind it is invented, or that people carrying these diagnoses are not genuinely suffering. This is the second time, and it is deliberate. A category being argued over in committee is not the same as a diagnosis being false. If you have been given a diagnosis, nothing here is a statement about yours. This episode makes no claim about any individual's care, and it never will. Keep your appointments. Keep taking what you have been prescribed, unless the person who prescribed it tells you otherwise. If you are in crisis, get help. Now put the manual back beside the populations this book has followed for 3 chapters. The prisoners of Project Start, the patients in the Kamowitz litigation, the teenagers at the Seed, the children at Willowbrook. For them, a diagnosis did double duty. It explained the behavior the institution wanted changed, and in the same stroke it authorized the institution to apply the instruments of change, under the heading of medical treatment rather than social control. The knowledge base entry on the weaponization of psychiatry puts the defining marker in one line. What distinguishes misuse from medicine, it argues, is non-therapeutic intent. The primary goal is not the patient's health, but social control, punishment, or discreditation. That is a high bar, and it should be. It is not met by a clinician who is merely wrong, or by a category that turns out to be poorly drawn. It requires the purpose to have changed. Here the evidence has to be labeled honestly. The Senate subcommittee did not examine the manual. Its focus was the programs, the money, and the legal framework, not the system of categories underneath them. So the claim that the manual supplied the conceptual infrastructure for what the subcommittee documented is inference, made by this chapter, not a finding made by Congress. It is a reasonable inference. It is still an inference, and it is labeled as one. And now the inference this series has to make carefully. Change the categories and you change what can be pathologized. Expand them and you expand who can be acted upon. The structural consequence is narrow but real. A complaint that is received as a symptom stops functioning as a complaint. One class of report becomes hard to test, whichever way it would have turned out. That is an argument about a mechanism. It accuses nobody. The last figure this chapter needs arrives with her method already built. Jessica Mitford made her name in 1963 with The American Way of Death, which took the funeral industry's vocabulary of dignity, service, and reverence and showed the commercial machinery running underneath it. The markups on caskets, the pressure selling, grief converted into margin. A decade later, she turned exactly the same method on a very different industry entirely. In August 1973, Harper's Magazine published Mitford's investigation into behavior modification programs running inside American prisons and state institutions. The title dispensed with subtlety entirely. The torture cure. Bluntness like that is usually a warning sign in journalism. On the evidence she assembled, it was earned. Mitford was not floating a hypothesis. She was naming a conclusion she had already reached by reporting, and then showing the reporting that got her there. What separated Mitford from the Senate subcommittee was not subject matter. It was vantage point. The subcommittee gathered the paper that institutions generate when describing themselves to each other and to the government funding them. Mitford went where the file could not, to former participants, to staff who had left and would speak, to practice rather than policy. Their accounts diverged from the official descriptions, and not merely in emphasis. Next, the vocabulary she put on record. What Mitford left behind was less a verdict than a vocabulary. Her reporting put a set of specific terms into public circulation, and each one names a distinct mechanism rather than a general mood. That precision is why they are worth taking separately. Each term recurs across the programs this episode has already examined, in prisons, in hospitals, in a Florida drug program. Named individually, an impression becomes a list, and a list can be checked. Start with aversion therapy. In the program's own materials, the electric shock, the nausea-inducing drug, the foul odor, and the physical restraint were never described as punishment. They were described as treatment, administered for the patient's own benefit, by trained professionals working to clinical protocols. Mitford's contribution was to insist that the subject's experience of the procedure, the pain, the fear, the helplessness, mattered to the ethical judgment at least as much as the program's language. Two of Mitford's terms share a name, and the overlap is itself informative. The START program she reported on was the Federal Behavioral Unit at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. It is not the same thing as the Bureau of Prisons Project START, a separate program documented in the Senate file. Two institutions working independently reached for the same reassuring acronym. That is how far the treatment framing had spread through the federal prison system. Marion, in southern Illinois, opened in 1963 as the federal replacement for Alcatraz, and the start unit inside it was built for prisoners the Bureau classified as particularly difficult to manage. The method was a graded system of privileges, with ordinary daily comforts released step by step in exchange for demonstrated compliance. Mitford's account of that unit, set beside the subcommittee's own documentation, made the federal prison system's investment in behavior modification impossible to ignore. One thing has to be said plainly here, and it will be said again before this block ends. Everything in this episode concerns prison units, closed institutions and programs run without consent, half a century ago. It is not a claim that mental illness is imaginary, that diagnoses are generally false, or that treatment is dangerous. Mental illness is real. Care helps an enormous number of people. Nothing here is a reason to stop a prescribed medicine. Vacaville was the California medical facility, a state prison hospital that became, in the reporting of this era, a byword for aversive conditioning. The aversive agent was a nectine, succinylcholine chloride, a paralytic that produces the sensation of suffocating while breathing is in fact maintained. It was paired with behavior the institution wanted stopped. Vacaville became a flashpoint in the public argument about behavior modification, and the reason has a duration attached to it. For roughly 2 minutes, a person given a nectine could not move or speak, and felt as though they were dying. The clinical vocabulary did not survive contact with that description. Whatever the paperwork called it, an agent chosen precisely because the experience is unbearable is functioning as a punishment. This is the collapse Mitford kept pointing at. The language holds until you ask what the person on the receiving end actually underwent, and then it does not. Token economies were documented in detail 2 chapters back, and they belong on this list. The principle is simple. The ordinary furniture of daily life, food choices, visits, free time, becomes a reward, released only for demonstrated compliance. What that does is turn the whole institutional environment into a single behavior modification apparatus. There is no off-duty hour and no neutral corner of the building. The ward itself is the instrument, and nothing inside it is simply given. The next term is the one that connects every program in this file, involuntary participants. Prisoners moved to a behavioral unit without their consent. Patients held under commitment orders. Adolescents enrolled by a parent or a court in something they had not chosen. The populations differ, and the common thread is narrow and precise. Not that nobody agreed, but that nobody had a genuine penalty-free option to refuse. Consent in these settings was a signature, not a choice. Parole leverage is the mechanism by which so-called voluntary participation was, in practice, so frequently compelled. A prisoner who joined a behavior modification program was demonstrating, in the language of the correctional system, institutional adjustment, something a parole board could weigh in his favor. A prisoner who refused was demonstrating a failure to engage with rehabilitation. Nobody had to threaten anyone at all. The structure of the system made the arithmetic obvious to every man inside it. The last term on Mitford's list is the quietest and perhaps the most damaging: no outside review. Across nearly every program she investigated, the independent oversight that the Nuremberg Code required, and that the Veterans Administration's own psychosurgery circular at least attempted to provide, was simply absent. The programs graded their own work using metrics they had chosen themselves. Suffering was not among those metrics, so officially it never happened at all. Strip away the magazine framing and Mitford's argument reduces to something quite precise, and it mirrors, in a different register, what the Senate subcommittee was saying in its own dry prose. Language was doing work the underlying facts could not justify on their own. Calling an aversive procedure treatment supplied a kind of institutional cover that calling it punishment never could, even when the experience of the person undergoing it looked, by any ordinary definition, like punishment. Because these programs measured themselves almost entirely by compliance. Did the behavior stop? Did the subject follow the rules? Did the institution become easier to run? The suffering involved in getting there went uncounted. It was absent from the very figures used to decide whether the program worked. So Mitford's instruction to a serious reader is a set of 3 questions. What is the actual method? What is the actual leverage? And what did the person actually undergo? It matters that Mitford did not offer this as a verdict on behavior therapy as a field. She acknowledged in passing that behavioral techniques, applied consensually and for genuinely therapeutic ends, can carry real clinical value. TI1 Voice's knowledge base makes the same distinction with a modern example. Stress inoculation training, chosen freely by a patient, is the legitimate counterpart to coercive stress conditioning. The same family of technique. Consent and review are the difference. This is the second time, and it is deliberate. If you are frightened, exhausted, or thinking about harming yourself, please speak to someone today. A crisis line, a doctor, a person who cares about you. Nothing in this episode is a reason to stop a prescribed medication, cancel an appointment, or try to handle any of it alone. Mental illness is real, treatment helps enormous numbers of people, and asking for help is not evidence against you. Here is the structural argument labeled inference, and it needs stating carefully. When a particular kind of complaint is received as a symptom rather than as a report, that category becomes self-invalidating. Seeking help produces the label, and the label filters everything said afterwards. That describes how a system handles one class of information. It is not a claim about any clinician or any diagnosis, and Psychiatry's own World Congress condemned Soviet political misuse in 1977. Now set 2 things side by side. A confrontation chair from a Florida drug program, and a surgeon's scalpel from a Veterans Administration's psychosurgery ward. In the Senate file they sit about 18 months apart, and at first they look like unrelated stories from unrelated corners. A grueling group session is not an operation that permanently destroys brain tissue, and this chapter does not pretend otherwise. The gap in medical seriousness is enormous. Read them together anyway. Read together, a single impulse becomes visible underneath both instruments. The belief that a person's unwanted behavior, drug use, aggression, breaking institutional rules, political dissent, could be corrected by intervening directly in the person, rather than by changing their circumstances. And that the correction could honestly be described in the vocabulary of medicine and care. The chair and the scalpel sit at opposite ends of a spectrum of intrusiveness, and share the justifying language. This is the through line the subcommittee itself seems to have recognized because it filed the SEED, the Veterans Administration Psychosurgery Circular, and the Nuremberg Code inside a single study. Those 3 documents do not describe the same program, the same technique, or the same population. They describe the same structural pattern, a vocabulary of care mobilized in the service of instruments of control. And the pattern becomes visible only when the documents are laid side by side. Laying the documents side by side is exactly what the subcommittee did, and exactly what this chapter, following its method, has tried to do, which leaves one question outstanding. Having assembled the programs, the paper trail, the journalism, and the international comparison, what did the Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights actually conclude in 1974? It reached a finding, and it deliberately declined to reach a solution. That distinction is where we go next. Laid side by side, the papers stopped looking like coincidence. By the time the Senate Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights finished assembling its 1974 study, one pattern kept surfacing in appendix after appendix. It was not a single conspiracy with a single author. It was something less dramatic and, in some ways, harder to correct. A reflex, repeating in places that shared almost nothing else, and repeating for reasons that made sense inside each institution. Consider the 3 settings the study documented. Referred adolescents inside a Florida drug program. Veterans on psychiatric wards at Veterans Administration hospitals. Prisoners inside federal behavioral units. They shared no staff, no budget line, no common author. Each faced its own practical problem, and each arrived, independently at the same answer, describe an intrusive or coercive intervention in the settled, respectable vocabulary of medical treatment, and the intervention borrows medicine's legitimacy. It matters that this is a reflex rather than a plot, because the two call for different remedies. A plot has authors you can name and prosecute. A reflex has no author at all. It survives because the vocabulary is available, because it works, and because nobody in the room is required to test whether the word fits the thing. That is harder to legislate against, and it is also why the record still repays reading. The sequence ran the same way each time. An institution has a population it finds hard to manage. It reaches for a method that is, on its face, coercive or intrusive. It describes that method as treatment. The description carries an implicit claim to legitimacy that the method, examined on its own terms, has not earned. And once the word treatment is in place, the question of consent quietly stops being asked. And the yardstick was right there, bound into the same volume. The subcommittee reprinted the Nuremberg Code as an appendix to its own study, 10 Principles written in 1947, in judgment of doctors who had also called their experiments treatment. Plain English, no jargon, unmissable to anyone who read past the front matter. The first principle is one sentence, and it decides most of what follows. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. One thing must be said plainly, and it will be said again. Mental illness is real. It is common, it is treatable, and psychiatric care helps an enormous number of people every day. Nothing in this episode is a reason to stop taking medication that a doctor prescribed you, to cancel an appointment, or to avoid asking for help. This is a history of institutions and of language, not a verdict on your clinician. So what did the subcommittee do with the pattern? Less than you might expect, and that was deliberate. Proposed no legislative solution. It drafted no bill criminalizing coercive behavior modification. It did the thing a congressional investigation can actually do well. It gathered the documents, organized them, and published them under its own letterhead. Publication was the remedy. The line between treatment and control would have to be drawn elsewhere. Drawn elsewhere, case by case, court by court, year by year. Before we get to that, let us assemble the file this chapter has built across its 11 sections, because no piece carries the argument alone and together they do. Piece A is the programs themselves. Piece B is the paper trail they left. Piece C is the international dimension and the theory that tried to explain both. 3 pieces, 1 shape. Piece A, the SEED's 12-hour peer confrontation sessions, and the psychosurgical scalpel on a Veterans Administration ward. These are not equivalent. A grueling group session is not an operation that permanently destroys brain tissue, and this series does not pretend otherwise. What unites them is narrower and stranger. The SEED dismantled a teenager's family ties in the name of rebuilding them. The surgeon's lesion tissue in the name of normalizing behavior. Piece B, the paper trail. Dr. Sweet's appropriations testimony in May 1972. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare's grant request that same year. Its advisability study that November, which raised concerns about session length and staff credentials. The Veterans Administration's Psychosurgery circular in 1973. The SEED's defensive letter in February 1974. Document after document raised the hard questions and then left them open. Funding continued regardless, and so did the procedures. Piece C begins abroad. In the Soviet Union, a diagnostic category called sluggish schizophrenia was stretched to cover political dissent, and citizens who circulated banned writing were committed to special psychiatric hospitals. The Serbsky Institute in Moscow became the best-known assessing body. This is the clearest documented case of psychiatry turned to political use, and it was named, investigated, and eventually acknowledged, including by Soviet psychiatrists themselves. That last part matters more than it sounds. The bodies that exposed and condemned Soviet political psychiatry were psychiatric bodies. At its Honolulu Congress in 1977, the World Psychiatric Association passed a resolution condemning the abuse and adopted an ethics declaration. In 1983, the Soviet Psychiatric Society withdrew rather than face expulsion, and it returned in 1989 only after its delegates acknowledged that political abuse had occurred. Keep that in view as the file gets darker. The theoretical strand is Thomas Zez, whose 1961 book argued that mental illness is a metaphor for problems in living. Mainstream psychiatry rejected that claim, and so does this series. The evidence that psychiatric conditions are real and treatable is overwhelming. What survived Zaz's overreach was narrower and sturdier, the observation that a diagnosis is also an act of authority, and authority can be misused. Jessica Mitford's reporting made the same point from the street. Precision matters here. The record documents named programs, named dates, consent that could not have been free, and diagnoses applied to dissent. It does not show that mental illness is unreal, that diagnoses are generally false, or that treatment is dangerous. Some literature in this field goes further and alleges outright conspiracy between psychiatry and police. The 1974 file does not establish that, and we do not assert it. Second time, because it matters more than anything else in this episode. If you are in crisis tonight, please reach for help. A doctor, a crisis line, an emergency room, a person who loves you. Do not stop prescribed medication because of a documentary. If you have concerns about your care, raise them with your clinician or ask for a second opinion. Understanding this history and getting treated are not in conflict. So what does recognizing this pattern actually change? For someone navigating institutions today, it changes the posture toward one word. Treatment stops being a description you accept at face value and becomes a claim with conditions attached, conditions you are entitled to check. Was consent actually voluntary? Was it actually informed? Was the intervention reviewed by someone independent of the person proposing it? Those are ordinary questions, and good clinicians welcome them. Here is the structural argument, and it is labeled inference because it reaches past the 1974 file. If a report is received as a symptom rather than as information, it can no longer be tested. The person is helped, perhaps, but the claim is never checked. One category of report becomes, in effect, undetectable. That is a problem in system design, not an accusation against anyone doing the receiving. For a researcher or an advocate, the value here is methodological. Read the primary appendices rather than the second-hand summary, because primary documents carry their own quiet admissions of doubt. That November advisability study raised concerns about session length and staff credentials. A summary might say the program underwent review and was continued, which is true, and which buries the concern beneath the outcome. Watch the gap between those two sentences. And there is a second tell worth naming, treatment language attached to compliance metrics rather than health outcomes. When a program measures whether the rules were followed instead of whether the person got better, the label and the reality have separated. Then anchor everything to codified precedent, Nuremberg's first principle on one side, the Kamowitz ruling of 1973 on the other. A claim tied to a standard outweighs testimony alone. Which leaves one last thing to say to anyone who has been told they are imagining the history itself. Confrontation therapy stretched to coercive extremes. Psychosurgery pursued with thin consent safeguards. Diagnostic labels used for social control abroad and, in weaker forms, at home. None of that is paranoid invention. It is documented, filed by a United States Senate subcommittee under its own letterhead. And that file is far from complete. So much for what the record will bear. The harder discipline is saying plainly where it stops. The file this chapter has examined was assembled in 1974. It is partial and it is open. Treating it as the last word on the weaponization of psychiatry would repeat the exact error this chapter has spent 11 sections warning against. Letting a confident summary stand in for the documents underneath it. For things sit inside that folder, and they are not obviously related. A Florida drug program for referred adolescents. A Veterans Administration circular on psychosurgery. Sworn testimony from a Harvard surgeon before an appropriations subcommittee in May 1972. And the Nuremberg Code, 10 principles written in 1947, reprinted as an appendix to the Senate study itself. That is the documented core. Everything else in this episode is scaffolding built around it. It is just as important to name what is absent. This file contains no Department of Defense human factors research. That is the next episode's subject. It contains no settled legal framework. The rulings and the National Research Act that followed belong to parts 26 through 28. And it contains none of the whistleblower testimony the later chapters examine. For boxes on a shelf carefully assembled, and nowhere near a complete history. Why insist on the boundary at all? Because a file read as complete invites overreach, and overreach is how a documented argument gets thrown away. Claim that the Senate study proves more than it contains, and one informed critic takes the whole thing apart in a sentence. Read as partial, the same file does something better and more durable. It sets a floor that later evidence can be built on top of. The yardstick here was chosen by the subcommittee, not by us. The Nuremberg Code was written in 1947, in judgment of physicians who also called their experiments treatment. Its first principle runs one sentence. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Somebody on that Senate staff decided the code belonged in the appendices, sitting beside the programs under review. That editorial choice is itself part of the record. Before we go a step further, let this be unambiguous. Mental illness is real. Treatment works, and it carries enormous numbers of people through the worst years of their lives. Nothing in this episode is a reason to stop a prescribed medication, skip an appointment, or avoid asking for help. The abuses we are about to describe were documented, condemned, and repudiated largely by psychiatrists themselves. That is precisely the point. The clearest documented case of political misuse is Soviet, and serious historians do not dispute it. From the 1960s, a diagnostic category called sluggish schizophrenia was applied to dissidents, people whose symptom in practice was persistent complaint against the state. Sidney Block and Peter Reddaway catalogued the cases in Russia's political hospitals, published in 1977. Jures Medvedev's own detention in 1970 was described in A Question of Madness. The mechanism deserves precision, because precision is what makes the case unanswerable. The category was drawn broadly enough that dissent could be read as its early sign, poor social adaptation, an overvalued idea about reforming society. No conspiracy of individual doctors was required. A diagnostic definition did the work. And this matters enormously. It is a practice the profession itself later examined and repudiated. That repudiation belongs to the history just as much as the abuse does. The correction came from psychiatry's own institutions, and it took the better part of 2 decades. In 1977, at its 6th World Congress in Honolulu, the World Psychiatric Association adopted the Declaration of Hawaii. In 1983, facing expulsion, the Soviet All-Union Psychiatric Society withdrew from that association. It was readmitted 6 years later, after officials acknowledged that psychiatry there had been used for political purposes. Slow, contested, incomplete, and entirely on the public record. One sentence from that declaration carries the whole reform. The psychiatrist must not participate in compulsory psychiatric treatment in the absence of psychiatric illness. Read it slowly. It is a rule written because the opposite had happened, repeatedly inside a member state, and because the profession decided that condemning it vaguely would not be enough. Ethical codes are usually autobiographies of the failures that produced them, written by the people who failed. So what changed and what did not? Ethics codes changed. consent doctrine changed. In the United States, the National Research Act of 1974 created a standing commission and the review board architecture that still governs research on human subjects. What none of that machinery reached is subtler, and it is the reason this chapter exists at all. No committee can govern how a report is heard the moment it is first made. Here is the structural argument stated as carefully as we can manage. If a particular kind of complaint is routinely received as evidence of illness, then that complaint can never be evidence of anything else. It becomes self-invalidating. And notice what follows from that logically. If such reports were ever true, a system built this way could not detect them. This is a claim about a filter, not about anybody's honesty. Now the limits of that argument, because it is easy to stretch past breaking. It does not show that any particular report is true. It does not show that clinicians are careless, captured, or acting in bad faith. It shows only that one category of claim is hard to test, and that difficulty cuts in both directions. The knowledge base puts the structural effect in a single line worth quoting exactly. Second time and deliberately. If you are frightened, exhausted, or thinking about hurting yourself, please reach out today. Emergency services, your own doctor, a crisis line, one person you trust. Nothing in this history tells you to stop a medication or cancel an appointment, and nobody here can tell you what is happening in your life. A structural argument about records is not a diagnosis. It never will be. The discipline this chapter models is the discipline the whole series insists on. 3 registers, marked every single time. Documented means a named case, a named inquiry, a date you can check. Context means what reformed afterwards and what did not. Inference means any line drawn forward to the present day, labeled as inference, out loud. Keep them separate and an argument survives hostile reading. Blur them together and it deserves not to. This chapter does not stand on its own. Part 22 established the full spectrum of behavior modification methods, from token economies through to psychosurgery, including the Feral Instruments Catalog and Mark and Irvin's book, Violence and the Brain. Part 23 documented the 2 captive populations, prisoners and institutionalized patients, and the programs that made consent an urgent question. What this chapter adds is the extension into drug programs and federal medical facilities. It also points forward, and the next step is the largest one. The 1974 study found federal machinery operating without adequate oversight, but it stopped at the edge of the defense establishment. Part 25 follows that same line of behavior research into the Department of Defense and the national security state, a different budget, a different secrecy regime, and a very different set of documents to learn how to read. After that come the courts. Parts 26 through 28 take up the legal framework that emerged across one extraordinary stretch of months. The Kamowitz ruling in July 1973, the Wyatt litigation in Alabama, Connect versus Gilman in the Federal Appeals Court, the case brought over Project START in Missouri, and the National Research Act, signed the following summer. Judges and legislators answering unevenly and late the questions this file had raised. Which brings us back to the sentence this chapter was built to earn. The question of whether treatment and control had blurred is not frivolous, it is not paranoid, and it is not new. It was asked by the United States Congress under oath with witnesses and appendices. The answer it received was troubling enough to end certain federal funding, build a new oversight architecture, and leave a public report behind. Half a century on, that report can still be read by anyone willing to go and find it. A legislator, a journalist, a researcher, a target. It is a file, not a verdict, and you are entitled to judge it yourself. One question it never settles is waiting for the closing stretch of this episode. Who decides where illness ends and ordinary human variation begins, and what happens when that boundary moves? So we close where the subcommittee left us, with a file, not a verdict. 1974. The Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights, chaired by Senator Sam Ervin, published a staff study called Individual Rights and the Federal Role in Behavior Modification. Into it went a Florida drug program, a Veterans Administration circular, a Harvard surgeon's testimony, and the Nuremberg Code. Let us lay those documents side by side one last time and judge them ourselves. Here is the American arc in dates. May 1972. Dr. William Sweet defends federal funding for psychosurgery before an appropriations subcommittee. June. A grant request describes the SEED as a national model. November. An advisability study questions its methods, its staff credentials, and its consent process, then recommends the money continue anyway. 1973. The Veterans Administration issues its psychosurgery circular. February 1974. The program's president writes back, changing the subject to results. Now the other arc, the one the Senate study never covered. At the Serbsky Institute in Moscow, psychiatrists deployed a category with no Western equivalent, sluggish schizophrenia. Its symptoms were dissent, unauthorized literature, unsanctioned faith. The biologist Jares Medvedev was hospitalized in 1970 after criticizing Soviet science. Vladimir Bukovsky, Leonid Plyush, and Natalia Gorbanevskaya followed. The hospitals holding them answered not to the Ministry of Health but to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Before we go any further, let us say this plainly. Nothing in the last 2 hours is a reason to stop a prescribed medication, cancel an appointment, or avoid a doctor. Mental illness is real. It causes enormous suffering, and treatment relieves that suffering for a great many people, every single day. What we have traced is states and institutions misusing an authority. It is not a verdict on the care you may need. And notice who exposed this. Not outsiders. In 1977, at its 6th World Congress in Honolulu, the World Psychiatric Association formally condemned the Soviet abuse, the first time an international medical body moved against one of its own member societies. It adopted the Declaration of Hawaii. The Soviet Association withdrew in 1983 rather than face expulsion, and was readmitted only in 1989. Psychiatrists policed psychiatry slowly under sustained pressure. Back in the United States, the Veterans Administration's 1973 circular was, on paper, genuinely demanding. Consent had to be informed and actually understood. It had to be voluntary. A reviewer outside the surgeon's own service had to agree, and no emergency could bypass any of it. But the men it was written to protect lived inside the institution proposing the operation, and their release depended on the same clinical judgment. A circular cannot close that gap. So the file assembles into 3 pieces. First, the programs themselves, a confrontation chair in Dade County and a scalpel on a veteran's ward, wildly different in medical seriousness, identical in their claim to be curing rather than controlling. Second, the paperwork, which raised real doubts and then left them open. Third, the wider world. Moscow, Thomas Zaz's critique from inside the profession, and Jessica Mitford's reporting from inside the programs. Keep the 2 columns apart because everything depends on it. The record establishes that a state diagnosed its own critics, that closed wards make consent impossible to verify, and that federal money-funded programs its own reviewers had doubted in writing. The record does not establish that psychiatry is a weapon, that diagnoses are generally false, that treatment is dangerous, or anything whatsoever about your own care. We will not blur that line. Jessica Mitford left us the working instruction. She had already stripped the funeral trade of its vocabulary in 1963. 10 years later, in Harper's Magazine, she turned the same method on behavior modification, under a title that dispensed with subtlety: The Torture Cure. She did not condemn every technique. She allowed that consensual behavioral methods can genuinely help. Her point was narrower. Read past the label to the method, the leverage, the experience. Here is the structural argument, and it needs no villain at all. If one particular kind of report is routinely received as a symptom rather than as a claim about the world, then that whole category of report stops being tested. Nobody has to act in bad faith. The system simply has no route by which such a complaint gets checked. A true one and a false one arrive looking exactly the same. A short vocabulary, because precise words are the whole discipline here. The Nuremberg Code, 10 Principles, 1947, and consent is the first. Sluggish schizophrenia, a Soviet category with no Western equivalent. The Special Psychiatric Hospital, a security facility that employed clinicians. The Advisability Study, a government review that doubted and continued. And the Declaration of Hawaii, the profession's own answer, adopted in 1977. Names, dates, documents, nothing else. We said this once already. We are saying it again deliberately, because it matters more than anything else in this episode. If you are in danger tonight, call your local emergency number. If you take prescribed medicine, change it only with the prescriber who wrote it. If you are carrying this alone, tell one trusted person today. Asking for help is not surrender, and it is not evidence against you. The Soviet case shows the loop at its purest, and Block and Redaway documented it in detail. A diagnosis justifies confinement. Behavior in confinement confirms the diagnosis. Protest becomes lack of insight, which confirms it once more. The chapter is careful to add that attenuated versions appeared in American institutions too, with nobody intending them. A refused medication read as continued illness. A decline program noted in a parole file. Now the inference labeled as always. Everything before this sentence is documented history. Drawing a line from Moscow in 1970 to any present-day case is argument, not evidence, and it has to be argued case by case with dates and documents. Precedent proves that a thing can happen. It never proves that it is happening. And nothing here tells you anything about your own diagnosis. We will not do that. Now, honestly, where the evidence runs out, nobody has published a reliable count of the adolescents referred into that Florida program by courts and schools. We do not know how many psychosurgical operations were actually performed under the Veterans Administration Circular, nor how many met its own standard. Block and Redaway cataloged hundreds of Soviet cases. The true total is unknown, and probably unknowable. The file is open, not closed. One sentence has carried this entire episode. American judges wrote it in 1947, sitting in judgment of physicians who also called their experiments treatment. A quarter of a century later, the Senate reprinted it as an appendix to its own study, so that every program in the front of that file could be measured against it. Read that line inside a locked ward, and the difficulty becomes immediate and obvious. Everything in this episode is checkable, and it should be checked. The spine is the 1974 Senate Staff Study, Appendices 1C, 4, and 6, held as Knowledge Base Entry 2. Around it sit Mitford and Harper's, the Kamowitz ruling, Block and Redaway on Russia's political hospitals, the Medvedev brothers' own account, Zaz and Goffman from 1961, and Wallenstein on the rise and decline of psychosurgery. Please go and read them yourself. A warm invitation before we finish. One Voice exists so that accounts like these are recorded properly, dated, specific, and kept somewhere others can read them. You will find it at one.witisk.org. Our live stream, TITV, runs around the clock at meet.witisk.org. Under Public, TITV. Come and read first. Add your own record whenever you are ready. Nobody is asked to hurry. Next time, Part 25. The Department of Defense and the National Security State. The 1974 file we have just read has a hole in it. It documented health agencies, prisons, and hospitals, but it never followed the same behavior research into the Pentagon, where the budgets were larger and the oversight was thinner. That is where we go next, human factors research and the national security machinery built around it. Bring the same discipline with you. Thank you for staying through a difficult 2 hours. If you take one thing away, let it be this. The people in this record were owed a real choice, and they did not get one. Insisting on that standard is not an attack on medicine. It is what the best of medicine already asks of itself. Look after yourself. Keep your own record honestly. We will see you next time.